basically, it's like a wheel trolley, like a soft side of a wheel trolley, except if you notice the back, it's got a full crop back with
Please come this way.
So my original...
So, hello and welcome everyone to the recording. All of us come around here. We're going to start in about another 10 minutes, but before we start, let's introduce each other. So, Ellie, please tell me, so live on YouTube and a recording, so tell everyone.
Yes.
Everyone's here, so please explain to everyone who you are and what you're going to talk about today. And what's your background?
Well, yeah, my name is Elnaz. You can call me Ellie if it's easier. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Queensland. My background is civil engineering, transport engineering, but then I work on supply chain, logistics, and transport side of problems. And I just recently got to know about blockchain like last year. So I started reading about blockchain and the benefits of blockchain application for supply chain. So I don't have IT or computer engineering background. So this presentation won't be very technical. I just provide background.
But I think it's going to be fantastic to hear, just understand the problem space. It's going to be fantastic.
I agree,
so thank you very much. Sally.
My name is Sally Nastel, and I had a career change in the last 5 years. I was in software engineering for 20 plus years, working in a variety of industries, security, identity management, mining, automation. I left that behind to do fashion design, which was my primary love. So I've seen an opportunity to apply blockchain to transparency and fashion manufacturing supply chains. There's a real problem there that needs to be solved. So it's very much in this conceptual phase, so I'll just set the scene for my talk. So that's it from me, I think.
Cool. And Felicity.
Hi everyone, my name is Felicity Dean. I'm from QUT, Queensland University of Technology. My background, it's been through a little bit of a process, as research usually does. It started looking at economic analysis using the law, of course. I'm from the legal discipline. So using economic analysis of what was the clean energy package in Australia, which was the emissions, it was supposed to be the emissions trading scheme. So it started with an environmental perspective, still in that perspective a little bit, but has moved to agriculture. But how I got interested in blockchain, similarly it was last year, and it was brought to my attention from somebody that I was working with in the shipping industry, about the benefits associated with it. He basically said to me, if you've got a bit of time, can you find out a little bit about this? And so it's it's taken more than a little bit of time to find out about it, and certainly not from an IT background either. So all law, and with a little bit of economics thrown in there. But so it's been quite an interesting process. And I was also, in mentioning the environment, I was looking at agriculture quite a bit, and that's what brought me, the marrying up of the different areas of the blockchain and agriculture has brought me to this project that I'm very excited about, that we're sort of just kicking off now, which is the Beef Ledger project that I'll be talking about today. So I feel very fortunate that I've been asked to be involved in it, so extremely grateful. But talking law, nothing technical, and I touched on a couple of little technical things, but I feel like I knew better to do that.
Look, I think understanding the top level is going to be really interesting to everyone, so thank you. So, all right, so everyone who's watching the live stream, Michelle, quick, we've got our last speaker is here. Come on, we're introducing the speakers to the live stream for the YouTube, for people on YouTube. So, Michelle, please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Michelle. Last semester, or the start of this semester, I began my thesis. The topic of it was using blockchains to provide a transparent supply chain in the fashion industry.
Yeah, all right, well.
I'm a student at UQ.
Cool.
Anything else?
And we're working together.
And you're working together.
Yes, okay.
All right, well, thank you very much, each of you, for introducing yourselves. And so we'll be back in about 5 minutes to kick off the presentation. Fast forward 5 minutes.
Transport ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get that.
Hi Michelle. Eddie.
Yeah, if you're just over there, that'd be great.
Last year.
Cool. Yeah, we do have 5 minutes. Yeah. It's all good. I would say about 1:30. Yeah. I mean, normally, I would have thought 20 minutes per person, but it depends on how quickly you go through your slides. No.
Go over or under?
No. But yeah, so we've had that. 35 people moved RSVP, which is a good number of people have listened. But I think it's the right level for a general interest kind of thing. So just, you know, the microphone on that live stream video camera is really good. And I'll see game, so it's good for this sort of environment. Yeah. No, and in fact, you can pick up what they're saying, anyone's saying in this room very easily. And everyone knows that. It's all good.
Very good.
Oh, pretty good. Yourself?
Well,
No. We've got presenting on
my name, we haven't met. Possibly, yes. Waiting for confirmation, I suppose. Actually, I really have a it hasn't been finished. Bring
after that meeting, yes, and
so you're
I'm also myself the network of architects that work with yeah, I will present my ideas. I don't know, something that's very information about the transaction but they need a lot of training. So that's something that we have.
No, I'm a bachelor. So yeah, mining actually costs
that's and maybe the two problems. So why I'm saying
Are you ready? Yep. Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. Hello and welcome everyone. Please grab a seat and you'll be able to continue your discussions afterwards. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you 4 people who are in the supply chain research area today. And so we have Elnaz, I should know,
and Ellie.
Ellie.
Yes.
Ellie to her friends, and we're all her friends. So we've got Ellie from University of Queensland, and we have Sally and Michelle from University of Queensland and a startup company. Credentia. Yep. And we have Felicity, who's from QUT, and all of them are going to talk about supply chain and provenance, which is interesting. So I reached out to people across UQ Griffith University and UQ2 and QUT to say, what are you doing? What research is happening? Who would be interested in speaking? And we've had 4 people come back and say supply chain. So obviously Brisbane is the geo centre, the capital of supply chain for the whole world, obviously. Oh, yeah, thank you. I always just go forward, but anyway. So in fact I should do that. And so there are their LinkedIn profiles. These slides are up on the Slack workspace, so if you want to grab the slides you can. There's 1 or 2 slides that have changed ever so slightly, but not in any great way. And so with that, I will pass it over to you, Ellie.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't have computer or IT background. I will be providing you the background and why I came up with blockchain application for supply chain. So it's more about the necessity of solving some solutions, some problems, some inefficiency problems in the current supply chain. So I just start with just a simplified framework of supply chain logistics. If you, supply chain starts with an exporter that might be a mining site or manufacture farm or anything, and then so it's either the raw material or manufactured products, and then it is transported by either truck, usually by truck or sometimes by rail, to a warehousing warehousing center or a packing center, and it goes to a origin port or airport, and it is shipped or just transported to the destination port in the other country. And then again, we will have the warehouse there and importer. So there's a contract signed between importer and exporter that, we call it bill of lading, that it can contain lots of items, including the trade items, that who should pay, what cost, and the other legal items, for instance, insurance or this kind of financial contract between them. And then at the end you will have customers. So, but it is a very simplified framework. Well, definitely you can see what's going on here, but it's just, again, another simplified framework of cotton export chain in Port of Brisbane. That because in my research project I'm involved in a project partnered with Port of Brisbane to optimize the supply chain logistics for them. So we had several meetings and focus interviews with cotton exporters and all the other agents that are involved, and you can see that. Oops. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just do that. I'm sure it's gonna reappear. Please reappear.
Please.
Oh no.
Anyway, so apart from so apart from exporter, that you can see, even they have lots of a variety of different subsectors. Then we will have shipping line, and we have empty container park, we have a distributor, packer, route carrier, and lots of the other freight agents. And this business process is just for exporting one shipment of cotton. So if you see, there are lots of transactions and interaction between these agents, and there are lots of back and forth communication between these agents. And there are lots of inefficiency, mismatch, and problems involved in the current system. So what are the problems? I just outlined some of the more important ones. One of them is unexpected delay. For instance, if a ship arrives late, then because freight agents can't predict, or usually they don't see that unexpected delay, then all the process afterward gonna have a problem here. And then lack of visibility of the location and situation of shipments. So exporters don't know that, or even shipping lines, they don't know that what are their containers now. And for such cases that we have unexpected delay or cost, then there are lots of disputes between agents that who should pay this cost of delay. For instance, if a shipment arrives late, then it has to be stored at the terminal, and so for a storage terminal, for extra truck movement, who should pay? Because it's not, there's no single truth, single source of truth that why this delay has happened and who was responsible. And we have lots of inefficient communication channel between these agents. Yeah.
How do we do that?
Well, maybe I can just change it.
New slideshow.
Yes.
And then just
Then hit back once, and then hit back a few times, and then it'll go out of autoplay. Cool, thank you, Brett.
So they usually just communicate with each other with paperwork, with PDF, just emailing to each other or phone calls, and there are lots of paperwork involved, and it is estimated that around 15 to 50% of the physical transport cost belongs to these paperwork costs and transaction costs, that because of inefficiency between them. And there's no cooperative market. For instance, if there are two importers located just next to each other, like Harvey Norman and Good Guys, and if they have one container that should be delivered in one day to them, because they're not aware, and there's no system that can match these two containers transported just by a bigger truck, like a B-double truck. So there are lots of unnecessary movements and extra movements that can be optimized. And with the simulation in my research, I showed that we can save about 40% of logistics costs if we have a cooperative market between these freight agents in the hinterland of Port of Brisbane, just for 2 weeks of container movement that I had that data. And there are lots of mistakes, double work, double spending, and of course, lack of real-time communication. If a ship arrives late, again, maybe port knows about it or stevedores, but then importer or transport company doesn't know. So they send a truck to load the container, but the container is not there. Again, the truck has to come back to the origin, and there are lots of these. And if you imagine that some of these importers are located in a very far remote area, for instance, Dalby or Toowoomba, then there's a huge transport cost involved in that case. And bill of lading, which is subject to fraud, it can be for some illegal shipments. There is a big issue for customs in Australia that they have to check. And the other issue is the databases of these businesses just belong to themselves, so they don't share this database. There is no single centralized database. They have their own system, even the optimization algorithms, but then the communication between these databases is very inefficient. There is no synchronization between different databases that these companies have. So long time ago, like about 20 years ago, some of the major ports around the world, like Port of Rotterdam, Port of Hamburg, Los Angeles, they started thinking that we need a centralized, we need integration and synchronization between these freight agents. And then they came up with an idea that they called it port community system, which is very beneficial for customs, admin stuff, and admin work that it should be done between these freight agents. So you can see that there are lots of, and again, that's very simplified. There are more agents involved in just supply chain of one shipment. So that was a centralized approach that they adopted. For instance, Port of Rotterdam has this PCS for more than 15 years, or Port of Singapore or Hong Kong, but they have a centralized system that it is getting a bit difficult for them and very costly, because the maintenance of that centralized database and the number of movements, container movements, just growing very fast every day. Even though that it has lots of benefits for those ports, for instance, apart from synchronization, it can be beneficial for resource and infrastructure planning. It can provide real-time situation of containers as shipments, and it can help freight agents to plan better. And also, it provides clear communication, or it can provide a cooperative market. But again, there are some cost involved for the port itself. But there are some barriers, as I said, and for Australian port, it is a bit harder, because the 5 major Australian ports, Port of Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Fremantle, they're all landlord ports. So they're not like Port of Singapore or Hong Kong or Los Angeles or Rotterdam, that they're a state-owned or government body. They're just landlords, so they just rent the land to freight operators. So they don't have any authority over these freight operators. They can't ask them that you should use this port community system and you should share your business data, and we give you the optimum logistics solution to you, because it is extra from their contract with these freight agents. And then again, there's a hacking threats that these major ports around the world are just started concerned about it. And for the operators, again, there are other problems. For instance, general concern is losing competitiveness, that if their business data is shared by port authority with their competitors, then they might lose that competitiveness in the market. Or the other main issue is that they don't have any estimation of the inefficiencies in the current system. Because it has been, traditionally running for a while, so they're not aware that there are huge costs involved with that. They just believe that, okay, it's been for a while that we are doing this business, and it is as it is, so we can't improve the situation. And then again, risk aversion and lack of trust in a new system, for instance, in a centralized system, and difficulty in adopting new technology, because they have their own system, database, software, so they're reluctant to jump onto a new platform. And also it's a threat for traditional businesses in overall, because for instance, there are some family businesses, transport company, that they're doing their business based on their experience, and if you tell them that we can have central portal that we can give you the optimum transfer solution, and then they think, oh, okay, we will lose our human resources, that they even may be their son or their staff that they're working there for many years. So because of those barriers, I started thinking, because when I presented the result of my simulation, that how a port coming system can be beneficial for Port of Brisbane, then the first question that came to port's manager was, okay, how we can motivate or encourage freight agents to use this system, because we don't have any authority. We just rented our land to them. After that, I started thinking that, okay, there might be some other solution that port doesn't have that central power, and then businesses maybe become more interested in participating. And then I got to know about blockchain. So last year I started reading about it. And that's my idea about the desired network type specification for blockchain, because, well, definitely there are lots of different network platforms like Ethereum or Fabric Hyperledger or others. But I think that for this use case, well, definitely tracking asset provenance, which is important, and I guess the next presenters will explain it better than me. But then I think that it should be a combination of business to business and business to customer platform, because for tracking asset provenance, if you think about, for instance, cotton supply chain, customer or beef, customer needs to know the track of the chain of transactions to see that, okay, that's the origin of, for instance, this beef is Australian beef. But then they don't need to know about the detailed information between two businesses, for instance, a shipping line and a trucking company. And then these businesses can have their own private channels with business to business, like a off-chain or a side chain, maybe you call it, that the data is not revealed to the other agents, it's just between those relevant agents. But then, based on some touch points, maybe the track of transaction between that off-chain, it comes to the main chain, which is public for customers, for users. And then, well, definitely I think I should have a modular design, because businesses should decide that, okay, what functionality they may choose. For instance, if even the consensus algorithm should be maybe can be different between these different side chains and the whole main chain. And multi-level access, again, to provide that security of data, and you know, businesses feel comfortable in using that. And without cryptocurrency, that's something that I started to realize that, for instance, some businesses like Port, they're not interested in any kind of cryptocurrency involved. They're interested in the distributed ledger technology itself, not cryptocurrency. Well, definitely the question is, okay, so who are the miners and what are their motivation to mine if there is no value involved? But because this kind of like businesses like Port, if you introduce the cryptocurrency, then it means lots of other legal issues that it might be a very big barrier for adopting even this platform. So yeah, I think I explained it. So we will have, for instance, requests between importer and exporter in off-chain, and there will be a smart contract between them. That just the time and maybe the dollar value or the location of the transaction are entered into that permissioned blockchain, and then it is validated maybe by just some peer value nodes that are defined by those businesses that they are involved in that sidechain, and then it attaches a block, but then I will have another permission blockchain alongside that between other, for instance, shipping businesses, and this one, it might be even another forthcoming system in the other country, or like even between the trades blockchain for importing the other country. And again, I want to talk about, I just started reading about different type of consensus algorithm, that what's the level of value information, what's the optimum level of sharing of information for these businesses, and what could be the best consensus algorithm for this search term. But still, I'm on the very preliminary stages, so I won't go into detail. And again, if we think that port coming system should be linked again to the other port coming system around the world, so we will have a community of these blockchains that they interact with each other, but then they don't necessarily need to get to know that what's going on in that. So I just imagine a hierarchy of chains that they're connected to each other. That's my idea or imagination that how it may look like. So because I guess Felicity and Selena, they will talk about supply chain. I won't go very into detail, but apart from even container transport, if you think about cotton is one of the major export commodities in Queensland. It's the second one after meat. And it is believed that Australian cotton is the most, highest quality, low contaminant, and most environmentally friendly cotton around the world. But when you talk with cotton exporters, one of their big issues is because of the lack of invisibility and transparency along the chain. Then sometimes in the destination country, the Australian cotton is mixed with some cheaper and low quality cotton, and for like branding industry, fashion industry, or clothing industry, then they think that they have been provided by Australian cotton while it has been mixed in somewhere along the chain, and it's one of the big issues that they're losing their competitiveness in the international market because Australia is a bit farther from the other countries like China, Bangladesh, because Australian cotton is exported actually as a raw material. So, I have the supply chain network of here. So we have cotton farmers here, and then we have ginning companies that they just export cotton seeds or lint to the other countries. For instance, if you consider China, that they have lots of manufacture there. So it goes from, for instance, Port of Brisbane to one port in China. It goes another to a warehouse. It goes to grinder, yarn spinner, fabric mill, cotton steel, and then the final product again might comes back to Australia and is being sold as a Australian cotton, high quality, but while actually somewhere along the chain in China it has been mixed with some low quality cotton. And because Australia is a bit distant from the other countries, so the transport cost is huge, and also the labor cost of farming and producing cotton is huge. So if they can't provide this transparency along the chain, they can't compete with, for instance, Indian cotton, because the labor cost is cheaper, they're closer to China, so the transport cost is cheaper, and then low quality, or even it's not, it might not be environmentally friendly cotton. But so okay, what's the point? China is interested in, I'm just providing an example, but they might be interested in mixing with Indian cotton instead of Australian cotton. So yeah, I just, because my background is transport, so I just provided you an example of application of blockchain for ports, but again, as a transport engineer, it might be even useful for mobility as a service, or ride sharing, these autonomous vehicles that you always hear about it, and the idea that there will be just one car that's not owned by one person, so it can be shared between different people, but again, we will need such a system to track. And then we have vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. that again, they're thinking about blockchain application for that and vehicle certificate validation and revocation system. So there are the other ideas of blockchain. But there are lots of questions that I'm trying to answer in my own research, and for instance, one of them is whether blockchain is the ultimate solution for this inefficiency, or maybe just a synchronization, integration of these databases. We can solve this problem, or we can reduce the cost hugely instead of thinking about a new platform architecture that might be a bit complex, or it might be blurry for industries. And then legal issues for smart contracts, which is a bit important. Who are the validators in this sidechain? So it really depends on these businesses that are doing business for a while, and they should decide about it. And what's the incentive of validators if we think that there's no cryptocurrency involved in the system? And I believe that equity can be maintained for small-sized businesses, which is the case here. If you are a small farmer, then you can't get access to that international trade market. You have to work with, for instance, JBS to export your beef, and usually small businesses suffer a lot because they can't take the credit of their own product. JBS or these wholesaler, businesses, they just somehow swallow all the opportunities. And designing a user-friendly platform, if you think about like cotton exporter, then they might not be necessarily familiar with technology or application, so it should have at least a minimum level of user-friendly system. And the interoperability between all of these side chains that I talked about. So these are the questions that I'm trying to answer, and I'm still on the first steps. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any questions? Yes.
Quick question. What is the solution to the cotton problem? As in, what technology do you put in place that ensures that the cotton's not being mixed?
Well, one of the it has been started by GS1 standard, that they introduced some kind of like a standard barcodes for products along the way, and then they started they launched a project named Supply Chain Visibility. It is funded by Australian Logistics Council. So they try to provide the visibility of this supply chain along the way. But the main issue is we can, make supply chain visible in Australia, but then we can't do anything in, for instance, in China or in the destination countries that's the case. So that's why actually I started thinking about blockchain, because I thought that if there is some kind of platform, open source platform, that these cotton exporters, they can be provided, they can push their buyers, or the other agents that use this kind of blockchain to provide the traceability of their shipments and solve that problem.
So is the problem the people receiving the cotton are receiving the wrong type, or is it the people are receiving two types and surreptitiously mixing it together?
Yes, they mix it.
So how do you put a technology in place to solve that problem?
Well, because if the time and location of these transactions, I guess your question is, because I have some sort of this question still in my mind, that okay, I can't see the transactions time and location. This shipment has arrived, and the weight of the shipment shows that, and then it goes to this grinder. This grinder uses this cotton and just pass it to a spinner. But then again, it is a bit complex. That okay, if they want to cheat, then still they can, because still they can mix it. Otherwise, I mean, unless that just Grindr provides every transaction that it has with every other businesses. For instance, if that Grindr has a transaction with Australian cotton and Indian cotton, then the weight or the time may explain, but still no one can force that. Yeah, that's the big issue that I guess I asked you, right, Peter,
Yeah, we
in our
talked
meeting
about it.
that
I think there are some solutions, but involving an overall permission blockchain solution, because you've got selective transparency and selective privacy that you want to maintain, and what you could imagine, say that you have some barcode that's on some big bale of raw cotton, and then you could imagine that barcode, so multiple barcodes then get scanned, and then they sort of are a hierarchy of barcodes. So you say essentially that cotton shipment ended up making that garment over there, and those other that whole string. And so then when you're in, say, Germany or something, you could go scan, and it could say, all right, so this theoretically had cotton from Australia from 6 months ago, and but then so if someone steals that barcode, essentially, if people could, then you're there and you're saying, well, why are they using 5-year-old cotton? I don't think this is a real barcode. I think they've stolen it. And it actually, I think, works much better in the meat, like in a raw food industry sort of thing, where you can get the package gets scanned right at the start. You probably can talk all about this, but where you can sort of scan right at the start, and then you'll say in Germany, you say, why was this was imported into the USA like 3 years ago, but it's supposedly on in Germany right at the moment, so this cannot possibly be the authentic article.
or maybe the weight of the shipment. For instance, if they imported like 5 containers, 500, for instance, kilogram of cotton, then they have to, because the weight doesn't decrease, so somehow it should be consumed. But again, that's the big question.
Just really briefly in response to it, that's sort of one of the things that we're looking at in the Beef Ledger project. It's about trying to incentivise the right sort of behaviour and get rid of the bad or misbehaviour and what's required there. And that's one of the economics questions. I think Ramon would probably know more about it than I would. That's going to be part of the study, is to find out, well, what do you need to do to incentivise good behaviour and eliminate this bad behaviour so that the economic incentive isn't there anymore to be doing the wrong thing. Because if it's possible to do the wrong thing, then generally it'll be, somebody will find a reason to do it. But if the reason's taken, if the economic reason's taken away, so that's one of the things that we're looking at, but I don't have an answer yet.
I think if you've got a zero-sum system as well, if you have 1 cow, you should get 22 tonnes of beef from 1 cow.
How does this cow grow so much over time? Right?
Especially like
hormones.
So if you had a sample of mixed cotton and a sample of the bigger stuff, would you be able to actually tell the difference?
Well, so those people, well, not me, definitely, but those experts, cotton experts, yes, they can. Based on the softness and even the length of the fiber.
So you could go to like David Jones and surreptitiously
Not me,
hole in
for
it,
sure.
and like do some DNA testing or something, some sort of testing. Okay. And would you be able to work different Australia from other?
Very much so.
Okay. There you go.
They cannot. They say that it's easy to recognize.
Does it require special tools, or is it expensive? Or?
Well, I just talked with cotton exporters, and they say, when you look at the cotton, you can see that, okay, that's Australian cotton. Not.
There you go.
Not for me, but.
Thank you. All right. All right, Beef Ledger. Felicity, you're up. So, Felicity's going to tell us all about Beef Ledger.
I'll tell you a little bit about Beef Ledger, what I know about Beef Ledger. Okay, I apologise for the notes. I have the double whammy of not only being a lawyer but also an academic, so I like to know exactly what I'm going to say. So I'll try not to just read off my notes, but I do go into a little bit of detail about the law around the beef supply chain, so hopefully I don't lose anybody. there. Unfortunately, I do love the law. That's something I have to confess straight up. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. Felt very privileged to be asked to be here. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for coming. So, I'm here to talk about Beef Ledger, which is, it's a new project for me. It's been underway for quite some time, but for me, I'm just starting to be involved in it more heavily now, so I'm very excited about it. But it also means that my knowledge about it isn't as deep as I will be in a couple of years' time, because it will take up quite a bit of my research time for the next 2 years, which is pretty exciting for me, at least. I have made an effort to not talk about too much in terms of technology, because I'm conscious of who my audience is today. But I do go into a little bit of detail, so please forgive me if I say anything incorrect. So because I've mentioned this, I'm a law academic, I can't get past the first slide without talking about smart contracts and how this applies to existing law. And really, smart contracts are at the heart of what I'm going to be doing in terms of the Beef Ledger project. But really, it's at the heart of everything with the Beef Ledger project. So I could start by talking about smart contracts and introduce the importance of the existing law, or contract law in particular, and talk about, well, how does this apply to smart contracts? And I have done this in the past, and I think that I've made a few mistakes in doing this. I've overlooked a couple of fairly important things, and it's a bit of a learning experience for me, being involved in blockchain and anything to do with IT, to be quite honest. So the first thing I would have overlooked is that the law is supposed to move with society. Society is not supposed to move with the law. So we can't sit here and say, well, how is this existing law going to apply to this new type of contract? When really, if we have this new way of doing transactions and new rights and responsibilities around these transactions, then the law should adapt accordingly rather than the other way around. And this is what happens, to be realistic. It's not really about keeping laws all the same, and if you consider, laws that are used frequently, they're changed all the time. So it's not like we have to stick with, this is the existing common law that applies to contracts, and somehow smart contracts have to fit within it. So that's not really something that's going to form part of my concern in the Beef Ledger project. The other thing I would have overlooked in talking about the existing law and contracts is that these smart contracts, they're not really contracts in the legal sense of the word. And I put this quote up here. This was Vitalik Buterin in October, which we're still in, had to share. October this year, he tweeted this particular two sentences that I've replicated here. He said, "To be clear, at this point, I quite regret adopting the term smart contracts. I should have called them something more boring and technical, perhaps something like persistent scripts." And that probably means something to all of you guys, but it seems to make sense to me too as a lawyer. So his Ethereum associate, Vlad Zamfir, I think I pronounced that correctly, presented his perspective on this, and he stated, he liked the phrase stored procedure, but said, "I for one don't regret the terminology. It's been a great learning opportunity for everybody." So Vitalik Buterin basically went on to say that he should have left the law out of it. And I imagine this is probably because he didn't really necessarily want to attract the attention of lawyers all over the world like he's perhaps done. That's just me guessing. I certainly wouldn't want all the attention of lawyers all over the world, that's for sure. So smart contracts are not, you guys would know this, they're not really contracts in many instances. So we don't really need to discuss the existing contract law in any great detail for these two reasons I've just mentioned. Because really it's about the law that's going to underpin the application itself. And so what I'll be talking about in terms of the Beef Ledger, and what I'll be investigating in the Beef Ledger project, will be the law associated with the beef supply chain, both in Australia and exported. So moving past, thank you for indulging me on that brief little discussion of that particular law. Moving past that to look at supply chain dilemmas, and Ellie's touched on this certainly in her presentation. So supply chain dilemmas are generally associated with information. And it seems that over time we demand or we require more information rather than less. And so there needs to be some way of basically addressing this need and desire. So conscious consumption, the demand for quality, knowing where your products have come from, the ability to trust the source of the information, they're all problems faced in supply chain, many different supply chains at the moment, certainly in the beef supply chain. So when we engage in a market as a consumer, forgive me Ramon, now I'm getting into economics a little bit. When we engage in the market as a consumer, we are often presented with many, many choices, and it's pertinent to the fashion industry, of course. If we want to buy a t-shirt, for instance, we'll make a decision, or some people will make a decision on their t-shirt based on various elements about the t-shirt, what materials involved, where it's come from, the environmental outcomes associated with how the cotton's been harvested perhaps, the company itself. You know, leaving aside that some people just like to wear a particular brand, that sometimes you'll buy a brand just because you know you can trust information about that t-shirt without having to investigate too much about it and without having to do too much background research. So that's generally one of the benefits of being a good quality brand and maintaining truth in your, or maintaining integrity in your brand itself. So let us consider information in making these consumer decisions along any given supply chain, not just the beef supply chain. So information asymmetry, it's something that's experienced in a lot, almost all commercial transactions. So this basically just means that one party has got more information about the product than the other. And they can have greater knowledge of the product, for instance, and depending on the nature of the transaction, they could potentially coerce a buyer anywhere along the supply chain into buying something that they don't necessarily want or need. So yeah, this could be the case for the end-use consumer or anywhere along that supply chain generally. And it can, if the information that's provided is erroneous, it can end up with everybody subsequent along the supply chain having incorrect information about the product. So this can obviously be a problem. Okay, so how do we fix information asymmetry? Well, it's through providing information that's correct, start, transparent information that people can rely on and can understand. So this is sometimes very difficult in existing supply chains if all of the information is contained in paper-based documentation that's held by all sorts of different companies in all sorts of different places. So getting information about one product, the supply chain, can be quite difficult. So I'm sure everybody here is well aware that computerisation along supply chains is nothing new. I know the shipping industry is reasonably antiquated when it comes to computerisation, but there's certainly companies out there that have taken that step. And so they've moved beyond this traditional paper-based reporting and antiquated systems into improved supply chain efficiency that way. And sometimes there's even the automatic data transfers that can also lead to efficiency and hopefully accurate information. So even though this is the case, there's still this inability to track products, usually from when they're produced through the end-use consumption. And the reasons for this, there's usually a variety of reasons for this. So even though there seems to be no shortage of data out there, it seems to be flying around everywhere, and the administrative burdens that are placed on people along the supply chain seem to be getting heavier and heavier, it still seems to be difficult for people along that supply chain to be able to trust that information. So this is perhaps because of differences in reporting systems. Sometimes companies are really protective of their data too. It's seen as being an asset and a resource and something that they need to hold on to. And people, as individuals, we're protective of our data as well. So obviously there has to be a balance between privacy requirements and providing transparency of information. But it's with some of these weaknesses in mind that a lot of these companies have adopted the blockchain solutions. And I don't really need to talk about all of the benefits of blockchain technology here, of course, but just to touch on it briefly, there's no need to trust the intermediary, of course. The data is shared. In some cases, it's readily available, depending if it's an on or off-chain transaction. Potentially, the data can be in real time. Obviously, there's delays to a certain extent, but can speed up processes associated with shipping in particular. I know that's something that Maersk have investigated quite a bit. The other good thing, and might seem strange, inventory can't exist in more than one place at once. So if something's updated about a particular asset, then that's going to be updated for everybody on the blockchain, as opposed to, well, you know, we've mixed this with this, and then all of a sudden we've had this cotton shipment duplicate somehow, and had children or something like that. So yeah, I've just listed a couple of use cases on the site. Obviously this is such a tiny snippet because there's just so much going on in this space at the moment. Sugar is another one of my interests, and that's how I became involved in agriculture. And they've actually just started investigating the use of a blockchain solution, not only for the supply chain problems, but also to address some environmental problems associated with sugar, which, as Queenslanders, I'm sure we're aware of some of those problems. So moving through to some of the problems that we particularly are looking at in terms of the Beef Ledger project. So food safety and food fraud, they're two problems that blockchain technology has its enormous potential to address these problems, and they are significant problems. So this is one of the main concerns of the Beef Ledger application, and it's just one of the things that we'll be investigating in the project. So I just want to start by saying that the supply chain fraud and food safety concerns, they're not just problems in developing economies. We're looking at China in particular, but I've spoken to companies here that say in a lot of instances we're given information about our food that's actually incorrect, and it's deliberately incorrect. So it's potentially less of a problem in developed economies than it is in developing, but it's well known as being a big problem in developing economies like China, and there's a number of reasons for this. As a lawyer, I should say perhaps it's lack of regulations. That's one possibility. Other reasons around food is this idea of nutrition transition and the diets changing in developing countries, moving from their traditional diets to diets that are generally associated with other countries, imported foods, for instance. So this leads to changes in terms of what is being made available to the people in those particular developing economies, and in particular it's leading to an increase in demand for things like beef that didn't exist quite some time ago. So where there's an increasing demand and an economic reason to do something about it, then often you will see bad behaviour involved and fraud happening quite a bit. So that's one of the problems that we're particularly dealing with in the Beef Ledger project. And sorry, now you have to indulge me just a little bit in the law around the beef supply chain. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the law that's going to be relevant to this particular blockchain application. So at the moment in Australia, there's a lot of regulation in support of maintaining the integrity of the beef supply chain in Australia. But when I talk about it, it might give you an idea as to why it's difficult to really trace, the product of the beef from the birth of the animal through to the end-use consumption, because there's so many different regulations and there's different government departments, there's different industries involved. So food safety and fraud in the beef supply chain, addressing that in Australia begins with the National Livestock Identification System. It's a national system, it's Australia-wide. So this is the system for the identification and traceability of cattle, sheep and goats, and it was introduced in 1999 to enhance Australia's ability to trace cattle during disease and any food safety occurrences. It's reflective of a domestic commitment to biosecurity and food safety, And the Department of Agriculture suggests that it provides a competitive advantage in the global market, basically having this system in place. So it combines 3 elements to enable the lifetime traceability of animals. It requires an animal identifier, like a tag of some sort. The identification of a physical location by means of a property identification code. And it's also got a web accessible database associated with any movements of the animal to a different property identification code address. So obviously what's involved there, if you take that particular animal with the tag, you move it from one location to another, then that's something that has to be updated, requires either paperwork or now a computerised system of updating that information. So as animals are bought and sold, they're moved along the supply chain, they've got to be tagged with this accredited device, and each movement they make to a location within a different property identification code is recorded centrally, and that information is kept. So every time I mention these things, you think about the administrative requirements involved, and whenever I think administration, I think of costs associated with it and what that adds to the end cost of the product. So they take this information, the NLIS is able to provide a life history of an animal, of their residency basically, and they can figure out, well, which are the other animals that this particular animal's been in contact with. So it's basically required, this NLIS is required to facilitate the traceability of animals in accordance with the National Traceability and Performance Standards. So these specify minimum standards. Okay, they have to be Australia-wide, but sometimes state and territory locate, and I haven't looked at this in great detail yet, so I can't say which one specifically, but they can increase these standards and actually impose a high burden on the recording and in terms of, you know, when records need to be kept and what needs to be kept about the particular movement and the animal itself. So it's implemented in state and territory legislation, even though it's a national standard. So any industry participants, they basically need to comply with the legislation in their own state or territory. So if they're operating across a couple of different states, and they need to know what the requirements are in those different states, which again adds a level of complexity, adds a level of administration, and again will add costs. So that's only during the lifetime of the animal, because once it's slaughtered, it ceases to be the concern of the National Livestock Identification System, and that's where things start to move to a different government department, and Safe Food Queensland becomes involved. So there's state and territory laws that govern the slaughter and processing of animals for human consumption, and this includes animals in the wild. Also preparation, packaging, transportation or storage of meat and meat products. There's regulations around all these things. So some of these are national standards, some of them are state-based standards. And again, adding to the complexity, adding to the regulations. Of course, they're there for a reason, but also adding to the costs. So there's also standards around the transportation of the animals, storage and handling, the production facilities associated with the supply chain, and that's just the regulation requirements for within Australia.
Is there any mapping between a certain animal and like a, I don't know, some packaged piece of meat, you know, because essentially between the NLIS and the Safe Foods Queensland, is there any mapping, or is it?
That's a really good question, and to give you my preliminary answer, it's no, I don't believe so.
Yeah.
That's something that I'll be looking at, but I was talking to the two different government departments this week.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't seem to know to. Look, I only spoke to a couple of people, so I'm not taking the whole heart of the departments. But they didn't really seem to know too much about the other standards, and they certainly didn't offer up any information about anything that existed, and I'm not aware of anything.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, I don't think that there's a way to currently map. I mean, obviously, there's information on your package when you buy a piece of meat from supermarket or butcher, and they know information about where it's come from.
Yeah.
But in terms of the computerised system that maps it, I'm not aware of one.
The only people who implement that are big places like Woolworths, Coles and so forth. They can actually certify beef as being grass-fed, organic or whatever. So they actually supervise and means tracking carcasses. If you're exporting stuff, I mean, I've worked for AP, Provenance, and I've contracted to IBM. Typically there in a reefer you will have half carcasses, and all those half carcasses will have some identification tag coming from the NIS on them.
Okay.
And the other thing is the containers are actually sealed for export. The refrigerated containers are sealed for export, and when they arrive at the port, the same seal, and there's a complete inventory that accompanies every single container that any shipping company moves. That's import export requirements between countries.
Oh, that's interesting. Chat later. So moving on to the export markets that you've just mentioned, what I just touched on there with the regulations associated with beef within the Australian supply chain, but at the moment, 70%, something like 70% of Australian beef is exported, and it's expected to rise over time because demand for beef in countries like China, it's rising rapidly. Changes in economic development, increases in population, increases in demand, and the nutrition transition that I mentioned earlier are all reasons behind this increasing demand. So, to give it a bit of another bit of context in terms of the Australian beef industry, apparently there's around 200,000 people involved in the red meat industry in terms of farm production, processing, and retail. And the argument is that Australia's free from most of these agricultural and aquatic pests and diseases, and it's got this reputation for quality, just like the cotton. And so if there was any type of disease or epidemic or anything associated with that beef supply chain, then potentially this could be very detrimental to many people in terms of their livelihoods. So what this means is that we've got this industry, they implement these really strict standards, and it incorporates all of these different levels of the Australian government. It's regulated by all of these different laws and processes. And when the end product is exported, you'd probably be well aware there's all these additional regulations, and not only that, then you have to meet the requirements of the market you're exporting to. So it's not just the concerns of the Australian market, because then when you're leaving the country, you're worried about the laws of that particular jurisdiction. And there could be laws imposed all along the supply chain in terms of the processing facilities, for instance. And the standards, I'm not quite sure about this at this point, but there might be different standards if you're labelling something as grass-fed over in a different market than if you're labelling it here. Because I don't believe there is any, there's no marrying up of those different standards as far as I'm aware. So there's all these different requirements, and so looking at these requirements, you can see that there may be a need to actually provide a faster way of doing things, a more efficient way of doing things perhaps, realise some economic gains through efficiency, decrease these administrative burdens, and improve these documentation requirements. So finally I'm getting to the beef ledger application. So it's going to draw upon the standards and the regulations that I've mentioned. These are all going to be part of the concern, and I'm certainly not across all of them at this point because there are so many of them. So basically I've mentioned that all of these standards and regulations add to the cost of a product, but it also means that potentially there's minimal opportunities for fraud, arguably in Australia along the supply chain, although apparently it does still happen. So if you consider these legislative requirements, you could see that if there is a fraudulent act, like after the container's opened in another jurisdiction perhaps, and the fraudulent act involves replacing good quality Australian beef with another substandard product, which apparently in some instances is not even beef, then this could in fact mean that your product's replacing the product that you've gone through all of these standards to maintain and then labelling it the same way could lead to problems with your product itself. If the quality is terrible, people may stop buying it, for instance. And it could also mean that the quality products are being priced out of the market. If there's a high incidence of the food fraud, then potentially that could drop the price overall. If Australian beef is somehow being created out of nowhere, it could drop the price overall, and would mean that these standards that are being put in place may mean that it's not worthwhile for these companies to be exporting to certain markets. Okay, so this is where the beef ledger will basically lead to brand assurance, potentially will no longer require trust in what your product is saying. Because at the moment it does require a certain amount of trust. You know, the things are labelled. If you buy from a butcher or from Woolworths, how do we know that what they're saying is the truth? And things are labelled accordingly in these different jurisdictions where apparently food fraud is taking place. And that is either trusted or it's not, or it's ignored. But basically the idea is it removes that element for trust because the information about your product will be readily available. So, like I've mentioned, I'm not going to talk about the advantages of a blockchain-based solution in any great detail because I think everybody here's more aware of it than I would be. But if I link back to my original thoughts about the information asymmetry, and I can say that the blockchain-based solution, it probably has the greatest potential to eliminate what is a problem in not just the beef supply chain, but just about all commercial transactions where one party has more information about a product than the other. And if your particular application is designed correctly, then future state changes can be controlled, arguably and hopefully, through incentivised programs and traceability. So it will have the advantage of being a record of the past and hopefully bringing about the ideal circumstances for the future. Okay, so I just wanted to read a couple of quotes, just a couple more things to finish up. I'm conscious I've been talking for too long. A couple of quotes from a recent article that Warwick Powell, he's the man behind Beef Ledger, he's recently written and posted them on LinkedIn. So first, Beef Ledger provides a secure storage of accurate information, building on the enhanced fault tolerance and censorship-proof attributes of decentralised ledgers. The blockchain will record data states, and through the use of smart contracts, state changes will be affected. The blockchain-based system will bring together the legal parameters and the data external to the blockchain that will ensure the data complies with regulatory requirements. This will ensure self-execution of state changes and effective auditability. All of these converging benefits will result in efficiency, improved traceability, trusted provenance, and as a result, improved product quality. Now, I did have a little bit more to say, but given that I've already run over time a little bit, I'm just going to show you the last slide there. It basically has what is going to be part of the solution through the Beef Ledger project, which is the packaging, which will have a number of different points of security, and information will be uploaded automatically, I believe, but yeah. So that's where we are, and those are Warwick's contact details. Before finishing up, I just wanted to mention, because we are just kicking off this research project, I think there's a lot of opportunities coming up in terms of at QUT at the moment for other people who want to be involved in this research project, people who are looking at perhaps higher degree research. So I think it's up on the QUT website at the moment. It's up on the Beef Ledger website as well. Oh, okay, brilliant. So if you know anybody that's interested, because we've got 3 different disciplines involved in the project at this point. And then those are my contact details. Thank you very much for listening.
Are there any questions?
How are the supply chain currently now? How's the regulation paid for? Is it some kind of levy along the way? How do you currently pay? How is the existing system paying for the regulation tracking?
How are they paying for the regulation? Well, it's just a requirement that's put on to everybody that's involved in the supply chain.
Right. So it's not a specific levy or anything.
No, there's no taxes involved in it, to my understanding.
But it's just a government regulation. So
it's a government regulation, so you have to basically, if you meet the requirements of the regulation, then basically you just have to comply with the reporting standards.
Yeah.
You have to fill in those forms, or you have to use the computerised system, which I think is being done more and more now. But there's no taxes involved in it or anything like that.
It's a bit hard to quantify what the cost.
The idea is that it's
now.
internalised in. The idea should be it's internalised in the price of the product, because it is a cost, but the actual cost itself is internalised in that product. It's borne by the people along the supply chain, and then if you end up being a consumer of beef, then you should be paying for some of that yourself. If there's, that's, yeah.
So who polices this?
Well, the NLIS is the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in each of the state locations. Well, that's in Queensland, but in each of the state-based locations, and then the food safety standards, Food Safety Queensland. So you've got different government departments involved, MLAs involved as well, but that's an industry body as opposed to a government department. So.
Basically, do you know that who are the validators of this?
They would be part of the government department, I believe.
So
Yeah,
the validators
that would be my
not
understanding.
Customers or not
No,
investors of.
I wouldn't have thought so. Like perhaps it could be. I could make something up, but I'd just be making something up. I would, if I was going to give an educated guess, I'd say the government department would have to validate the information. There'd probably be audits through the government department, but I am guessing.
Yeah,
that's just my understanding at this point.
Yeah, because I had a chat with Warwick like 3 or 4 months ago, and they pre-sold their initial coin to a very internal, small, closed group of Chinese investors. So my question after that, it just triggered in my mind that what's the motivation of this like 10 Chinese investors in buying the initial cryptocurrency of this if they're not validated? Yeah, so that was a big.
I suppose the idea is that the value will be created over time in the beef ledger branding using this blockchain solution.
Investors, they don't have any authority or power over.
Oh, you're talking about the administration of the beef ledger project itself?
Yes.
Those
initial.
I don't have an answer for you. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, so it is over to you, Sally and Michelle.
Oh, thanks.
Just press that, is it?
Big one is forward.
Big one? Oh, the big one, okay. Hello everyone, my name is Sally Astle. I'm a fashion designer now, but in a previous life I spent 20 plus years as a software engineer and engineering manager in various areas, identity management, security and machine automation for mining. I'm the founder of a startup, Prudentia, and I'm working together with Michelle Foster from UQ, who's going to talk a little bit later. I just want to say that this is a very idealised approach. It's in concept only, it's in research mode, and I'm not a blockchain expert by any means. I read about it 3 years ago and I was fascinated by it, thinking that it was about a salmon article, and I thought, why can't we apply it to the fashion industry? And so ever since then I've had an interest in this. Well, the problem to me is we all buy clothes. I know I love clothes, I buy clothes. But we don't really think about who made them. We don't really think about how much people were paid making the garment, because we just kind of naturally assume that people are paid their living wage for the job they do, but it's actually not true. We're actually unethically exploiting people by buying certain items. So the problem is that how do we validate who made our clothes and under what conditions? There's a whole big problem of ethics in the fashion industry. There's a growing awareness of this now. Particularly in the last couple of years, you'll hear that people are starting to become ethical in their labels, but there's a lot of greenwashing going on, I believe. How do we really trust what's happening out there in the industry? You probably all recall about 5 years ago, Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, the building collapsed. There were nearly 1,500 people were killed. And that's because they overloaded all the floors. They're all sewers in the manufacturing area. Being exploited, total disaster, of course. Disaster is always something that piques interest in people. to bring to light stuff that's going on. So research shows that as little as 4% the price of an item of clothing sold in Australia actually goes towards paying people. That's a pretty small amount when you think about it. It's pretty disgusting. Women are working 6-day weeks. They're often taken away from their families. I saw a few documentaries when I was doing my fashion degree about, you know, they had to go away from their babies, 6 days a week, working 12-hour days for a pittance. Wouldn't even cover their costs for anything. Miserable lives, totally miserable lives. It was a real eye-opener for me. Oxfam, a couple of years ago, commissioned a report working with Deloitte about, they worked out big brands that make billions of dollars of money, that if they paid everyone in the supply chain the living wages, it would only actually add about 1% to the cost of a garment. So if you buy a $10 t-shirt, theoretically it would be $1.10. So it's really not a lot of money to help people's lives a lot better, make them a lot better. So by collaborating with the University of Queensland and Michelle, she's completing her master's thesis, working with me on the back end, and the fashion industry. I've only been in the fashion industry a little while, so I'm not an actual expert on the fashion supply chain, but I know enough to be dangerous. I'm working with Jodie Hilton, who's the founder of the New Guard, which is a full-stack fashion studio startup. So together, the three of us are working to try and put together a prototype to get some funding. The solution, Credentia, is going to enable transparency in supply chains. We're hoping, it's actually, the unique part about it is it's going to be consumer driven. So I think with these large problems, and again I said I'm looking at it very idealistically, there's so many layers of complexity in this problem that it's very daunting, so I'm trying to stay here to be focused and positive to go forward. The consumer is often the way to create a groundswell and creating a market difference for these brands to start sitting up and taking notice of, hey, people are actually buying ethical brands that can prove they're ethical, because as I said, there's a lot of greenwashing out there, so consumers are actually interested in buying garments that are really ethically made, can be proven. Hence, that's why we're setting up transparency in the supply chain using blockchain technology. That's a no-brainer here, as far as I can see. And I've been attending the meetings and trying to get as much information as I can to go forward with this. The actual addressable market is huge. In Australia alone, we have $28.5 billion in fashion market value. We export $6.5 billion of fashion products per year, and that's just in Australia. So worldwide, it's one of the biggest industries, and it's the second most polluting industry in the world as well. Fast fashion, you know, the idea of getting a garment out there that's trendy for the season, it's very cheap to be made. People are flocking to buy them. And then they're thrown away at the end of the season. Not only do we have the problem with ethics, we have the problem with environmental issues as well. So it's a huge complex problem. So why blockchain? Again, you're all experts and I'm not. Peer-to-peer, a lot of the fashion brands now are going into the lean logistics model, supply chain models. They like to be able to talk to every different vertical in their supply chain. It's distributed. Often the supply chains in fashion brands are global. So we need to be able to talk to everybody all over the world. There's so many verticals involved. We have the producers, the suppliers, the manufacturers, the distributors, retailers, and of course the consumers. And it has the ability to support the transfer of goods, so the consumer will actually be able to look at the app and to be able to visualise that garment's journey. There's a high level of redundancy, no single point of failure, and it doesn't require a trusted third party or for nodes to trust each other to operate. What's in it for us? Technologically speaking, we'd like to be able to introduce an innovative solution in a relatively new field, which, as I said before, is gaining a lot of interest in the fashion industry. Ethics is becoming a trendy thing. So we want to eliminate that greenwashing that goes with being a trendy thing, and put out an implemented solution, hopefully that has an interesting edge to it for the competition. So the second one, commercially, we want to provide a solution to the problems caused by lack of transparency in supply chains, and we want to be able to have that provenance for people to visualise on their mobile apps from the consumer point of view. And ethically, we want to give the consumers the power to choose ethically produced clothing by being able to prove this with a token on the swing tag. A swing tag is just a label on the garment. Forgive this, it's not a UML diagram. I don't even know if UML exists anymore because I haven't been in the industry for a while. This is just a schematic. So I'm just trying to represent here the designer sits in the middle of the peer-to-peer technology, able to talk directly to the primary producers, suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers and consumers. What we envisage here is the primary producer will have some sort of unique identifier, maybe RFID token or something like that. We'll initialize at the beginning of the supply chain. The primary producer will enter the farm details, the cotton details, all that sort of thing. And then they'll ship the order off to the next part in the supply chain. The suppliers will be the people who produce the material or the trims that the manufacturers use. They'll enter their information and so on, updating the RFID as it goes. And each of these verticals will have some set of APIs that will be able to talk to the back office systems, because I think there's a lot of good information sharing there for each of these verticals that would be useful. In order to guarantee what goes into the blockchain, I'm thinking some independently employed auditors who will ensure that what goes into the blockchain is accredited and correct. And the retailers also will have an API interface to their POS systems, because there's more, again, there's a good information exchange here. And the consumer, each of these verticals will be using a data entry based web interface, which either on a laptop or a mobile, and the consumers will be using a mobile application to scan the swing tag, which has the RFID token with all the information embedded on it. And what they should be able to do is to get a pictorial schematic of being able to drill down on what happened with the manufacturing, who actually did the manufacturing, what did they get paid, all that sort of thing, and they can be assured that the information is correct at the time. Going forward, I'm hoping to build up an ethical garment portal, if you like, being able to have a database of ethical labels. Labels will come on board, subscribe, hopefully, because it'll be people who want to be part of this project that come on board. So there won't be, hopefully we'll avoid that politics of trying to drag people along with things. And also in the future have some sort of e-commerce engine. There's an awful lot of things that can be built in this in the future. The next step for us is producing a minimal viable product. We'll look strictly at the fashion industry. Obviously, in the creative industries, this type of application can be applied to other things like Indigenous art, corruption art, which is out there. But we're going to stick to the fashion industry, and we're going to align with the manufacturing vertical only, because that's probably the most complex area. Because lots of manufacturing factories will outsource their garments anyway, which could be further outsourced. So there's multi-tier layers of manufacturing going on, because they're trying to cut costs all over the place, because the competition is huge, as you can imagine. So it's a very complex area, so we'll probably try and deal with that first and do onshore domestic, rather people that are producing onshore, which is an easier use case to deal with first, to get that prototype up and running. Proof of concept, if you like. So we'll have a test suite of a blockchain back-end working prototype, a website data entry program, both for supply chain participants, and we'll have a mobile app for consumer use. And then we're going to go and seek some funding. And with that, I'll hand you over to Michelle, who's going to talk more about the blockchain research that she's been doing in conjunction with this project.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as you know, I'm doing this as part of my thesis, and I'm essentially making the back end of this application. So when I started this about 13 weeks ago, I had previously studied blockchain and information security. But I really didn't know anything at all about fashion, and not very much about Ethereum. So a lot of the early research was just getting to grips with the fashion industry itself, which, as it turns out, you could write an entire thesis on that alone. From what I can tell, it's an extremely convoluted supply chain. It goes all over the place, and it's not reliably tracked. As for Ethereum, at the start, I was just mostly getting to grips with using the many, many tools for Ethereum developers out there. So I began with MetaMask, I used Solidity in Remix, installed Geth, played around with that, then Mist. Eventually I settled on developing mostly using Truffle and Ganache to set up the network. From here, I could kind of divide the problem down into its basic components. We define the scope as focusing on manufacturing alone, just because this is one of the areas where stuff goes wrong a lot. This is where a lot of the unethical practices happen, and it's where it's incredibly hard to actually track things, because garments go through several different processes. Maybe somebody sews on a button and then sends it off to the next person who does something else, something else, something else. So by the time it actually makes it to the retail outlet, who knows where it's gone. So for the problem itself, I kind of define the main areas to work on as actually storing information. The solution for this, because I wasn't exactly sure how much data we'd need to store, but it was a pretty safe bet that it would be enough, that we probably can't store it on the blockchain itself. So our solution was to use IPFS. So for those who are unfamiliar, that's the Interplanetary File System. It operates kind of a lot like the blockchain in that it's a peer-to-peer network. Once you store data on it, you will get back the cryptographic hash of that data, which is more or less your receipt, so you can use it to retrieve it at a later date. The benefit is that it doesn't cost nearly as much as it would cost you to actually store it on Ethereum's network. From there, I did kind of build a very small demo using a truffle box. Pretty much all you could do with it would be to input a value, in this case the wage of an item, which would then get stored on the IPFS network, and then you could store the hash on the blockchain network. And then you could use that to look it up again. So that kind of more or less solved the storage part of things. We know how that's going to work. The next biggest problem was actually the trust issue. How do we verify information before we put it on the blockchain and say, yes, this is true? And we don't really have a neat solution to this. We have a couple of solutions. One which Sally Ann brought up would be actually using some of the creditors who already work in fashion to verify that or validate it. But there's a few other approaches, and it's going to take a lot more research to finally get that working. So the next part that I want to look at is pretty much the ethics behind it. The big questions I'm looking at are, what do consumers actually want to see about their products? Which is its own very complicated area. Obviously, there's environmental factors, humanitarian. And then there's, what do we think ethical actually is? And then finally, how can we measure that? Since a lot of this is not exactly quantitative data. Okay, so that's more or less what the back end of this is. The next things we have to do are understanding what our use cases are. We need to find a couple of people who'd be willing to sample out our product. We need to design the front-end UI, the data entry on websites and mobiles. Obviously, part of that is we'll need to know exactly what we want to store, so what consumers actually want to see, and what we can reasonably get from that. And then we'll need to design the user interface for the mobile app. And that's more or less where our product is now. Next bit.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions still to be answered, but as I said, very concept mode. There's a lot of commonality between supply chains in various areas and domains. So should we all be reinventing the wheel? So that's my question, having been brought up with library reuse and all that sort of thing. I think, is there something more efficient we could do collaboratively between supply chain groups, for instance? And things are changing so rapidly underneath us with blockchain, as you know, and there's privacy issues. A lot of manufacturing people and labels don't want anyone else, any other labels to know where their manufacturing is done, is it competitive then. So there's a lot of security issues to do with this as well. So there's piles and piles of things to be investigated with this. So lots of challenging things ahead. That's why I wanted to stick to a very simple use case to get the proof of concept done. Subsequent releases will start looking at manufacturing offshore. Over time, we'll build up a repository of ethically produced labels so that hopefully we'll be the go-to portal for ethical label purchasing, shopping and browsing and just validating really. And there's other verticals in the creative industries. As I said before, there's quite a problem in First Nations art. You know, the Indigenous art you find in galleries, they're charging thousands and thousands of dollars for them. How much does that Indigenous artist actually get paid? So there's a lot of different applications that this application could possibly address in the future. So it's really about putting that power in the hands of the consumer from my point of view. So I'm hoping you found this interesting, and if you have any questions or want to collaborate with us, that would be great as well. So because there's a lot of material here, and I think there's a lot of promise for the future in the fashion industry and the creative industries in general. So are there any questions?
You mentioned so giving power to the customer.
Yeah.
But is there also something for the producer actually? I mean, is there a way in which the producer can have an input there? Or?
Oh, an incentive for the producer, possibly?
Yeah. Or
the main incentive for producers is that it's a lot of brand marketing for them done by the consumer.
No, actually, I mean more, for example, the actual people who are working, let's say. Is there a way?
Oh, the manufacturer, yeah, people who work in the factory, sorry, yeah.
The labourers.
Yeah. Yes, in the future releases, I haven't mentioned any of this here, but I was thinking that possibly we introduced some sort of charity percentage from the government to go back to those manufacturers, whether it's in Bitcoin or something like that in the future. But at the moment, I'm just not looking at that. But I think there's a lot of possibility that there could be some sort of reward system for those factories that are performing well, just by making some sort of percentage, low percentage of the garment given back to the producers. Does that kind of answer your question?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, you could, if they were to scan the garment, and you can see this person, you know,
Yeah,
who did it.
yeah.
I'm going to give them a tip.
Absolutely,
You know?
yeah. There's an awful lot of there's no. I mean, in all seriousness,
You could
that,
give them like
yeah.
$10, and that'd probably
Yeah.
give them, you know, a month's salary or something.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a lot of potential with an application like this. So it's not that I'm biased. I actually seriously do think there's a lot of potential with different aspects of it.
Connecting you with the real
Yeah,
person.
yeah, but it's just that at the moment we need to narrow down so much to try and get some funding to move it forward. And sure. And as I said before, if anyone is actually interested in helping or collaborating, please let me know. Yeah. Is there any other questions? Or supply chained out?
It's been fabulous. So if we can go to that next slide, that would be fab. So everyone, we are here we've got 2 more of the meetups here, and then we'll be moving across to WeWork at 310 Edward Street. And so you can get the slides that you're seeing today on the Slack workspace or on the general Slack channel of our Slack workspace. The invitation link to that is on the meetup group. So next week I'm going to talk about the future of blockchain, which is going to be very exciting. But before I do that, Brett, t-shirts. So thank you very much for to all of our speakers today. And as a thank you, Brett has brought in some t-shirts which will hopefully fit. And I have no idea whether they're ethically.
No, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Hopefully someone can just look at them and say Australian cotton.
Well, no, unlikely. So I actually got carried away and brought in more than t-shirts.
Oh wow!
So I brought in a little thing for each of you, and it doesn't currently contain a t-shirt, but we'll discuss its sizing in a minute. We're not being recorded, as that sounds.
All right, well, thank you everyone.
Okay, now I have
Not a problem at all.
I'm also just help the team.